1980s, the decade when Sri Lanka was grappling and crumbling due to violence. India, being her neighbor, decided to mediate and restore peace. And hence, on 29 July 1987, the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord was signed, under which the Indian Peacekeeping Force (IPKF) was deployed to Sri Lanka to restore peace and harmony. It wasn't only the unfamiliar environment that our soldiers had to navigate through, it was far more than that. Hello everyone, I am Neha from Mirasy, and today we have with us Major General Arjun Muthanna. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Major General Arjun Muthanna is an alumnus of Sainik School Bijapur and Government College Mangalore. He joined IMA as an NCC entry candidate and was commissioned in the Gadwal Rifles in 1978. He was deployed in key border insurgency and terrorism affected areas at all levels of command, platoon to brigade sector commander, and as a staff officer in various headquarters, including Director Foreign Training at Army Headquarters and Head of Operations and Training in the Indian Military Training Team in Bhutan. His academic qualifications include MSc and MPhil in Defense Studies. Major General Muthanna was deputed to Karnataka, his home state, in 2010 to enhance its counter-terror capability, where he set up the state police's Center for Counter-Terrorism and its counter-terror response force, the Garuda Force. He retired in May 2016 as additional DG of NCC for Bihar and Jharkhand. He is currently Director HR and Training of Trident Automobiles in Bangalore. He has authored Enabling Military-to-Military Cooperation as a Foreign Policy Tool Options for India, How the Wind Blew, Op Pawan, IPKF Veterans Tell Their Stories, Valiant Were Their Deeds, Operation Pawan, More Personal Accounts of IPKF Veterans, IPKF, Undying Be Their Memories, Personal Accounts of IPKF Veterans of Operation Pawan, IPKF, The Brave Hearts of IPKF, Operation Pawan, For the Honor of India, IPKF in Op Pawan, Guts, Glory and More. Thank you, Major General, for accepting our invitation for this much needed conversation today.
Thank you.
To begin with, would you like to tell us about the significance of 29th July?
Yes, so 29th July is the date that the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was signed between India and Sri Lanka with Rajiv Gandhi, our Prime Minister, and Jayawardene, the Sri Lankan President, co-signing it. This came about after some very frantic and hectic parleying between the two sides, with the LTT, who was the most dominant Tamil rebel, Sri Lankan Tamil rebel group. And this was what paved the way for the deployment of the Indian peacekeeping force on the island of Sri Lanka. Accord was signed in 1987, and for many of us in India, amongst the IPKF veterans, we commemorate this day, that is 29th July, as the day that resulted in the IPKF being deployed there, and the 32-month deployment that the IPKF had till the last soldier and the last sailor and the last airman, if I can say that, finally de-inducted from the island.
So, would you like to elaborate on Operation Pawan and also your role in Operation Pawan? What were your experiences?
As in the norm of the Indian military, we give every operation or every deployment a code name. In this case, the name given was Operation Pawan. So it sort of made things easy for us to, for our internal functioning, to use this word. So Operation Pawan commenced the day that the troops started getting inducted into Sri Lanka. There had been a little bit of preliminary information at different levels. Some had information, some didn't. But in the sum total, as part of the preparation, people had been, we had Tamil interpreters from other units embedded with the units that were to go in. And there was some amount of preparation, but there was also a great deal of secrecy. And so when the deployment took place, the entire attitude and approach was we are going there as friends of both the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil people of Sri Lanka and the main Tamil rebel group that was LTTE. There were other groups, but they were the most dominant one, and they were the ones who were actually doing the talking that was happening on behalf of the Tamil, Sri Lankan Tamil people. So the deployment took place initially with a great sense of bonhomie, where troops, many units had been informed that, it's go with all your ceremonial stuff. It's just a question of, it's completely peacekeeping, so you won't really have to do any fighting. You just go and intercede between the two till then warring parties, that is the Sri Lankan military and the LTTE, and then we will progress to the other parts of the agreement. The other parts of the agreement involved the Tamil Tigers, that is the LTTE, laying down their arms, with the Indian peacekeeping force ensuring their safety, and also having the Sri Lankan military withdraw into their barracks or into their bases, so that there will be no more armed conflict on the island. So this started off initially. There was, from the military point of view, I wasn't there, but I spoken to people who were there. So it was all good fun. People had pitched camps without any defensive or offensive intent. It was more administrative. So people were living in tents with no breastworks or boundaries or anything, any defensive positions as such. But there were niggles. The astute commanders who were on ground, battalion commanders, company commanders, and even the brigade commanders realized that the LTT was still not completely confident about what uh, guarantees the Indian government and the Indian military were trying to convey. They still did not trust the Sri Lankan government. They did not trust the Sri Lankan military, and as a result of which, whatever weapons were being surrendered were being, were either damaged weapons or the weapons they didn't want or little antiquated weapons, and they were a little secretive because they took all their orders from one person, and Prabhakaran still didn't trust either of the parties. They didn't trust the Sri Lankans in any case, and they were quite wary about what India and the Indian government would do. So there is interesting reading. All the key players in the game have written books. Our then High Commissioner, Mr. Dixit, who was one of the key persons in ramming home this peace accord and all the parleys that went on, has written a book, and very illuminating, of course. My role came up later on. So what happened is, with all this toing and froing happening, with still more discussions going on with the LTT and telling them to trust us and come completely above board, it wasn't going the way we would possibly have wanted it to go. The Sri Lankan government and their military was keeping an eye, and they also had their own reservations about the LTT's intent. Matters came to a head when a boat was intercepted on the high seas by the Sri Lankan Navy, and in that boat they found some key members of the LTT with weapons and obviously with some warlike stores. And these people were picked up and brought down to Jaffna. Uh, the Sri Lankan government then took a stand that they were in violation of the peace accord and they would have to be dealt with in accordance with the Sri Lankan laws. India was trying its best to tell them to take a softer stance and let these guys go, and things could be worked out. But the Sri Lankan government was pretty adamant about that. The LTT was very apprehensive because they were very, very worried that anyone being picked up by the Sri Lankan government would be put through very intense interrogation, and they would be unable to sustain the interrogation, and they would uh, spill the beans pertaining to whatever plans they had. So there was a very tense standoff at the Palali airfield that is a part of Jaffna. And finally, matters came to a head where the people who were there, out of those people who had been apprehended. So
Yes.
once these people consumed cyanide, and the Prabhakaran was visibly very upset and very angry. He made a lot of what shall I say, fiery statements. And as a result of that, the IPKF received orders to forcibly disarm the LTTE. And this disarming was to have commenced on the 10th of October. And the IPKF was actually caught flat footed because they hadn't really prepared for the eventuality of having to, fight the LTT and from the peacekeeping force become a peace enforcing force. And this led to initial reverses. You must remember here the LTT had been prepared or had been preparing to fight the Sri Lankan military prior to the arrival of the IPKF. That is, IPKF came in July, and they had been fighting the Sri Lankan military in the months of May, June, and to some extent the early parts of July of 1987. They had taken a lot of precautions. They had made a lot of preparations to fight the Sri Lankan army. And strangely, the Indian peacekeeping force, the troops that had moved ahead, had not done the necessary intelligence gathering or the situational awareness where they should have possibly been moving around the areas and seeing what was happening, familiarizing themselves, and always catering for an eventuality that things could go south. So there was the IPKF, which had been there for the months of, end of July. So you say you had August, September, 2 months, and about 10 days in October. And despite that, the IPKF didn't have maps. They hadn't really done any orientation in terms of having to fight the LTT. They possibly didn't have any tactical intelligence. They hadn't even familiarized themselves with the areas around themselves, uh, around their deployments. And so on 10th October, when all the fighting began, there were reverses, initial reverses. My own, and then of course, because of this initial reverses and the need for speed, because after all, here was a conventional large army from a big country and a big military power like India, fighting what was till then thought to be a ragtag rebel force. There was need to show initial successes, and speed was demanded by the people in Delhi. And some units were, in an effort to speed up things, in an effort to utilize the entity to the extent possible, suffered immense amount of casualties from uh, all the deployments and all the explosives and the landmines that the LTT had previously uh, embedded and the previously had laid out in anticipation of the Sri Lankan military advance. That is in the months of May, June, and July. So my own unit were amongst very many of the units which were suddenly pulled out from peacetime locations in India and rushed to the island. There was a sense of urgency compounded by some little bit of, I would say, not so calm thinking. And units were moved, units were split up, and then they were landed at different places. In some cases, they were committed to operations without full preparation. They were depending, because my unit was lucky that way, though we were split, and surprisingly, we were split in air when the unit was airborne. That was in the month of the third week, towards the end of the second week of October. We got airborne from Gwalior, and as we were flying into Sri Lanka, someone gave the pilots orders. The unit was split mid-air, with one portion landing in Trincomalee and another portion landing in Jaffna. And then, of course, we were fortunate. Our commanding officer and the brigadier he was reporting to were very cool people. They took time, and then they made sure that the entire unit was concentrated and employed in a way that definitely reduced our casualties. In the initial part, units were a little short staffed, so there I was posted somewhere else in North India in a headquarters, and I was very rudely pulled out from there and ordered to report to my unit in Sri Lanka in Jaffna. I was relatively newly married, about a year old, and I just took my wife, dropped her off at Chennai, then Madras, requesting my brother-in-law to come and pick up his sister, and I proceeded to the island. So for me, it was a quite rude movement or a rude redeployment. But then a lot of units had it that way, and in any case, we are all bound by the oath we take, that is to move as ordered, where ordered, and when ordered, even to the peril of our lives. So we moved, and a lot of people like me moved, not only officers but men, and a lot of other people moved. So this was how things happened. In the month of October, October 1987, the IPKF did suffer a lot of casualties in an effort to clear the Jaffna Peninsula of the IPKF. Notwithstanding these casualties, they were successful in doing that. But mostly, rather than destroying the LTT, it was more that the LTT decided, in a large part, to vacate the Jaffna Peninsula, to seek shelter and refuge in other parts, mostly in the deep jungles of Vanni or in the deep jungles of Vavunya. In this month of October 1987, there was one huge operation that was conducted, which is now referred to as the Jaffna University Heli Drop, where uh, I would say a botched operation. The only silver lining on that entire botched operation was the heroic resistance of a platoon of 13 Sikalai, where they held their grounds in respect of the orders that they had, and finally, literally dying last man, last bullet, because out of one officer and 30 men there, finally only one man survived, and that too because he had been shot and had fallen unconscious and was later on found to be alive by the LTT fighters who swept that area, looking for looking to see if there was anyone alive. So that was one very bad operation. But in as a whole, I would say, notwithstanding the operations that the IPKF uh, sustained, the final military professionalism came to front, and the LTT, being a pretty decent guerrilla force, realized that they could not really oppose the might of the Indian army, I would say, and they quickly assembled whatever remnants of the forces they had on in Jaffna, and then most of them withdrew. So by the time I reached Jaffna, maybe in the first around the first week of November, there was a relative cessation of hostilities. There was still a little bit of shooting and firing going on, but in most cases, people had they were in a position to start slowly moving out of the refugee camps or the places of refuge like temples and schools and churches, and they were slowly trickling back into their homes to find out what had happened. There was some large amount of damage, of course, and then having fled in haste, and then when the IPKF was advancing into Jaffna, there was fighting. So obviously there was some amount of damage to the houses, some amount of, I would say, very sadly, collateral damage where civilians got shot. This is one thing that has been discussed, but I would request listeners to remember that the LTT at that stage was not uniform. They were fighting in cities. So the IPKF were always faced with this challenge. Is that a fighting rebel or is it a civilian? And in some cases where trust was placed and no action was taken against what was thought to be a civilian, it resulted in the death of an IPKF soldier or some soldiers. So as a result of this, there was some amount of collateral damage, regrettably. Once that happened, with Jaffna, most of the active fighting in Jaffna having reduced, and then slowly Indian Army, with all its extensive counter-insurgency experience, went about setting up a grid of deployment of what we called operating bases or company locations, and patrolling and all the other activities that went on there, mainly to deny the area to LTT fighters and to bring about some amount of peace and stability to the people of Sri Lanka, that is in Jaffna Peninsula. Things in the Vani jungles were a little different, though initially it was all quiet. But as the IPKF started moving into those areas, into the areas of Vavunia, and they started aggressively patrolling those areas and asserting domination of those areas, they came into contact with the LTT who had taken shelter in the camps, and there was a lot of bloody fighting that went on there. It was, I would say, pretty evenly matched because the LTT were fighting literally for their lives and with their backs to what you can say the wall. And the IPKF, of course, had to learn on the job because they had to reorient the way they fought. And they had to reorient how to deal with the LTT because still the LTT wasn't actually fully closed or fighting like an organized military force. So again, you saw somebody, could be a civilian, could be an LTT fighter or something very difficult to distinguish. The LTT also employed a huge amount of little boys and to some extent girls also. The boys were known as Pudians. These were young boys who would act as spotters, who would act as couriers, as messengers. And the general attitude of the locals were that, look, they have no option, they have to support the LTT. In some cases, if they didn't support the LTT, they would be shot, they would be killed, or as the LTT would call it, or the locals call it, they would be lamp posted. That is, they would be taken away from their homes, tortured, and then finally tied to one of the street lamp posts and shot dead. And their bodies would be there, and no civilian dared to go and take out a body, even if it was one of their loved ones, till someone from the IPKF came and did that. So it was pretty scary, I would say, for an average citizen there because they were stuck between the LTT and the IPKF. In the larger interest, while all this fighting was going on, the IPKF and the Indian government went ahead with doing their best to implement the various conditions of the peace accord. They got the Sri Lankan government to agree to amalgamation of the two provinces, the north and the east, into one province known as the Northeast Province. They got the Sri Lankan government to devolve powers to the province and to an elected government in the province. Elections were held. Provincial elections were held. The LTT, in their wisdom, boycotted it. So we had other groups, other rebel groups, and other Tamil political groups that were amicable to working with India. So we had Vardharaj Perumal who came in and was finally elected as the chief minister, as a new post, as the chief minister of the northeastern province. A provincial government was set up, and things were possibly had a chance to, to go to a situation where Tamil interests in the island would be protected, and the LTT, and the IPKF at some stage could possibly withdraw from the island. Well, I was a company commander in Sri Lanka. My battalion was deployed mainly in Jaffna, but then we are also responsible for covering some islands around Jaffna. One island was the famous island of Delft, or Kites, as it is also called. Delft was an island that had been colonized by the Dutch, if I remember right, and that's how they got the name Delft, because that obviously is a Dutch name, and they do have a place in Europe which is also named Delft. So we did undertake operations. Our bulk of our operations would be patrolling through our area, denying the area to any fighters, making sure that people had peace and stability. And interestingly, within about 3 months, we had all the coaching institutions open. We used to have streams of children uh, resuming their coaching, their tuitions, because the Sri Lankan education system meant that you had to excel in your O levels, that is your class 10, and in your A levels, which is your class 12, if you had a chance to join the university. And for somebody to go to university in Sri Lanka meant something very, very big, because only the best went to university, to college. As a matter of fact, I remember one of very esteemed local citizens was very pleasantly surprised. I would say, not say surprised, I would say was shocked when I told him that every officer of the Indian Armed Forces is a college graduate. And I could see that his attitude towards us changed, because the Sri Lankan government didn't have that policy, and most of them felt that the military wasn't educated at all. So these children, the parents would seek to see that the children were safe, that they could all go off and do their tuitions. And for me, that was a very encouraging sight. The local bus system started. They had these small matador-like vans, which would ply through the entire Jaffna Peninsula. People started moving around, putting together their lives. Some amount of business started, and we could see that when we went around town, economy was picking up. Things were, to some extent, I would say, coming to normal, but it could never be completely normal, because obviously there were weapons on the street. The LTT would come, and every once in a while, to show that they were still around, would undertake some sort of action against the IPKF, and as a result of which the IPKF would retaliate, or in an attempt to flush them out, we'd be conducting search operations, search and destroy operations. Raids would be there. People would be, detained for interrogation. The Sri Lankan police force wasn't uh, functional, neither were the judiciary function. But then the IPKF, I would say, with our counter-insurgency experience back in India, had a system whereby there was an accountability for anyone who was detained for any questioning. People named, they had to be details had to be communicated to higher headquarters. There was a sense of accountability. There was a sense of responsibility, that we are not an army that can rampage through the civilian population and do as we wished. But there were incidents, there were in a few cases accidents. So there was a great degree of accountability and responsibility that was shown. So as an infantry company commander, that was my day. You go out, patrol the area, dominate the area, undertake specific intelligence-based operations. So we would carry people with us who would spot terrorists. Our aim basically was to take them off the streets. And it was a tough grind. We never knew where we were going to be shot from. We never knew who was going to shoot at us, because it could have been a man, a woman, an old. I mean, it could be anybody. After all, the guys who were there, left behind in Jaffna, were wearing CVs. They weren't wearing uniforms in any case. So every time you stepped out of your camp, uh, said it, went out with a prayer on your lips, and with a great hope that is there in all human beings, that we will come back and we'll get to see another day. And tough times, we lost people, we lost men in many cases, out of being decent and not uh, responding with a heavy hand. We took casualties. The LTT were pretty innovative in the way they would undertake actions against the troops there. And the units that learned fast, that learned and that were smart, minimized their casualties, or to some extent didn't have casualties. Those who didn't learn suffered. And I must say, uh, it was sad to see that people didn't want to learn, or didn't learn, and didn't learn fast enough. So I was there. We were fortunate, as the Indian Army had a system of, I won't say rotation, but leave. You got some time off after every few months to go back home, because our normal lives were continuing. Your normal assignments across India were continuing, your training in India was continuing. So in between your deployment here, somebody would be going back to India to attend some training program. And then, of course, like in my case, my children were born when I was deployed in Sri Lanka. So I got a couple of days off to go home and see my kids. I had twin daughters, so I got a chance to do that. So that way, we had some amount of a balance. We got a break every few months. And those of us who were fighting in Jaffna were a little more fortunate because while the risks were high, but we had creature comforts. And those of our comrades who were in the jungles had it rough both ways. But at least there they didn't have to worry about civilians, civilians coming in their way or civilians having to deal with large bodies of civilians when you are actively uh, hunting or fighting the entity.
We understand that this has been one of the longest peacekeeping operations of India. So we'd like to know, how does India commemorate the legacy of IPKF?
Yeah, this was a 32-month deployment. The Navy, of course, continued to be deployed on the seas for much longer than that. Commemoration, well, we lost about 1,200 officers and men in Sri Lanka. A bulk of them killed in fighting, a few, of course, in accidents. Figures aren't very accurate because of the confusion there was when people went in. Uh, the we had about 3,000 injured, some pretty grievously. One of a Jawan from my own unit was paralyzed below his waist, and he, of course, continued to live for another 12 years. Poor guy had been recently married, and his wife stood by him for those next 12 years. The unit, of course, continued to look after him and help him and his wife. As far as the commemoration goes, uh, I would say unit-wise, we have never forgotten our fallen. As a nation, we do find a mention in the National War Memorial that has now been set up in Delhi. There's a plaque. There are names of all those who have fallen. The commemoration as such, however, does not take place in the sense that how the two uh, Vijay Divases are commemorated in India. That is one going to be to commemorate Kargil Divas and one on 16th December to commemorate our victory in Bangladesh. There is no formal or official commemoration of the IPKF deployment. A group of veterans are doing their best to project, to rally, to request, and to appeal to the government to identify 29th July, which is just a few days away, as the IPKF Day, and to hold a formal commemoration ceremony at the various war memorials by the government. Currently, the only commemoration that takes place in Delhi is by veterans. They just gather there. A few families gather, widows of fallen soldiers, children of fallen soldiers gather there. Interestingly, Sri Lanka has been much more magnanimous. There is a huge IPKF uh, memorial in Colombo, very well maintained and very nicely done. And I was fortunate to visit that place with my classmates from my school. A very poignant memory because you can walk up and read the names of your fallen comrades. There are a few other memorials which are there in Jaffna Peninsula around the military bases, Sri Lankan military bases, which are all very well maintained by the Sri Lankan army, and due respect is given to them. And whenever Indian IPKF veterans or other Indian veterans or people have traveled up to those places, they have been facilitated all assistance to pay their respects. In India, we have a tradition. Every unit, especially the infantry units, uh, continues to commemorate the day by honoring its fallen. A few of formations that had served there, for example, the IPKF headquarter, rather the IPKF headquarter, which was based in Madras or Chennai, finally evolved into a core headquarters. And It is the 21 core in Bhopal, and they continue with that legacy of having been formed out of the IPKF headquarters. So they also have commemoration. And the divisions, for example, 57 Mountain Division, which is currently deployed in the Northeast, was also deployed in Sri Lanka. An IPKF veteran had been the General Officer Commanding, General Binoy Poonal, and they have, of course, created their memorial there. So that way, there are a number of memorials. Even in Bangalore, we have the National War Memorial, but there's no particular plaque as such. It's just the names that are listed there. So commemoration, India did publish a couple of postage stamps, and as I said, there is no formal noise or statement that is issued, which is very very sad, considering we lost 1,200 of our comrades, and here it was a 32. IPKF was a 32-month deployment, and we lost 1,200 of our comrades, and the Indian government, be whichever political party in power, does not find it fit to do that. It's a very, very sad thing. Not only for me, for all the veterans, for the families of those 1,200 soldiers who laid down their lives. And I would say it's a shame for the nation that we don't find it in us to commemorate it. In my own way, I have put together accounts from various veterans. So in 2022, I was able to bring out over 120 accounts spread over 5 books. And these books are all available on Amazon. They're all listed under my name. So if you Google Arjun Muthanna, you should be able to find those books. My humble plea to our citizens, fellow citizens, to our older generation, and to the younger generation, please don't forget the sacrifices these 1,200 soldiers made. They obeyed the demands and the orders of their government, and to the peril of their lives. A few of us who came back, we were the fortunate ones who came back, but then it's the only way you can actually honor their sacrifice is never to forget it. So please, the older generation, educate the younger generation about what the IPKF was all about.
As we bring this episode to a close, with all my heart, I would like to thank Major General Arjun Muthanna not only for taking the time to speak with us today, but also for his unwavering commitment. You are an inspiration to all. Staying true to Mirasy's motto, your legacy, our responsibility, and in this case, this is our legacy and our responsibility. We pay tribute to the IPKF and honor the legacy they left behind. Let us ensure that their stories are immortalized, echoing through the annals of time for generations to come.
Jai Hind.
Jai Hind. Let us know in the comments what would you like for us to unearth. Don't forget to subscribe to our social media handles, our YouTube and audio podcast platforms for more such exciting stories.